Benjamin Ben Harper was 28 years old when his older brother told him to find his own place before first snow, because married men with children came first when winter supplies ran short. It was August 1864, on a homestead claim near Lawrence, Kansas, and family loyalty only extended so far when 7 people needed to eat from stores meant for 5. Ben's parents had died in 1862 from typhoid fever within 3 days of each other. His older brother, Michael Harper, age 33, had inherited the family homestead and taken responsibility for younger siblings. Had done right by Ben for 2 years, but Michael's wife Ruth made household calculations clear in August 1864. They had 4 children under age 10. Winter was coming. Ben contributed farm labor but consumed valuable food and space, and he needed to establish his own household elsewhere. Ben had saved $43 from occasional work as hired hand for neighboring farms, had no land claim of his own, but located an abandoned 40-acre parcel 3 miles from Michael's homestead. Previous owner had given up and returned east. Ben could squat there through winter, maybe prove it up properly come spring if he survived. The critical problem was firewood storage. Kansas territory had adequate cottonwood and willow along creek bottoms for fuel, but keeping firewood dry through winter was a perpetual challenge everyone faced. Firewood got wet from rain and snow, would absorb moisture from damp ground, would freeze solid in cold weather, becoming difficult to handle and burning poorly when finally brought inside. Ben had cut and split approximately 3 cords of cottonwood during late summer, adequate fuel for winter if kept dry. But storing it properly required shelter, and building proper shed was expensive. Conventional construction, 4 corner posts, wall boards, roof rafters, hundreds of board feet of milled lumber at premium prices. Total cost perhaps $30 to $40, money Ben didn't have. The insight came from observing indigenous structures and remembering stories from trappers who'd wintered in rough country. The Osage built arched lodges using flexible saplings bent into semicircular frames covered with bark or hides. The arch shape shed rain and snow naturally. Required minimal materials, just poles that could be cut free from creek bottoms. What if he built a firewood shed using the same principle? Arched willow frame covered with overlapping bark strips to shed water. Elevated floor to keep wood off damp ground. Simple ventilation gaps to allow air circulation, preventing moisture buildup. The structure would keep wood dry while costing almost nothing. The design crystallized through August. Semicircular arched structure 12 feet wide, 16 feet long, 6 feet high at apex. Willow pole framework bent into arches. Cottonwood bark covering overlapping like shingles. Raised floor platform 18 inches above ground. Ventilation gaps along bottom edge. Total cost perhaps $7 for the few nails and rope needed. Everything else could be harvested from surrounding land. The community's reaction when Ben explained the plan was immediate skepticism. Firewood sheds were 4-walled structures with solid roofs because that's what worked. An arched willow frame with bark covering was primitive construction that would leak, collapse under snow load, or rot within 1 season. Real shelter required real lumber and proper carpentry. John Mitchell, age 46, a successful farmer and informal leader of the Lawrence area settlement, tried to talk sense into Ben in early September when word of the plan spread. "Ben," he said directly, "firewood sheds need solid walls and proper roofs. Your curved willow design will fail. Snow will collapse it. Rain will leak through bark covering. Your wood will get wet, and you'll burn damp fuel all winter, producing more smoke than heat." "Arched shape sheds snow naturally," Ben countered. "Weight slides off the curve rather than accumulating. Overlapping bark shingles shed water like proper roof if installed correctly. The structure doesn't need to be permanent. Just needs to keep 3 cords dry through 1 winter." "What about the elevated floor?" asked Mitchell, genuinely trying to understand. "Wood sitting on ground stays in contact with moisture, but building raised platform requires lumber you can't afford." "I'll build simple pole platform," Ben explained. "Cut straight cottonwood poles. Lay them parallel 18 inches above ground, supported by short posts. The gaps between poles allow air circulation from below. Wood sits on poles rather than ground, stays dry from ground moisture. You're risking your winter survival on $7 worth of materials and primitive construction, Mitchell said, frustrated. My brother has room in his shed. $2 monthly gets you proper covered storage. That's real security. Ben thanked him for the offer and proceeded with his plan. He didn't have $2 monthly for rental, needed his savings for food and basic supplies. The arched shed would work, or he'd figure something else out. Construction began in early September and required solving multiple problems using only materials Ben could harvest or purchase cheaply. The foundation was simple: 4 cottonwood posts set in the ground at corners of 12 by 16 rectangle. Short cross posts between them created support for the elevated floor platform. The floor platform used straight cottonwood poles approximately 4 inches diameter cut from creek bottom growth. He'd cut 30 poles 16 feet long, peel the bark, lay them parallel across the support structure with 2-inch gaps between them. The poles created elevated surface, keeping firewood 18 inches above ground, while gaps allowed air circulation and drainage. The arch frames were the critical structural element. He needed approximately 40 willow poles, long flexible saplings that could be bent into semicircular curves. Would cut 2-inch diameter willows 12 feet long from creek banks, transport them while green and flexible, bend them into arches before they dried and became brittle. The willow cutting took 5 days of hard work at Wakarusa Creek, 2 miles from the abandoned parcel, and the labor revealed why most people preferred buying milled lumber despite the cost. Harvesting materials from nature was brutally time-consuming, even when the materials were free. Ben would rise at dawn, eat cold cornmeal mush, walk the 2 miles to the creek carrying axe and rope, arrive at the creek bottom thickets around 7 a.m., when light was adequate for selecting suitable willows. The ideal poles were 2 years growth, straight, 2 inches diameter at base, 12 feet to first major branching, flexible enough to bend without snapping. The creek bottom was dense tangle of willow, cottonwood, wild plum, and undergrowth. Had to wade through knee-deep water in some sections to reach the best willow stands. The work was methodical selection and cutting. Examine a candidate willow for straightness and diameter. Cut it at ground level with axe if suitable. Strip the branches with knife. Set it aside for bundling. Each pole required perhaps 10 minutes from selection to prepared state. 6 poles per bundle meant 1 hour of cutting and stripping per bundle. He needed approximately 40 poles total, 7 bundles. At 1 bundle per hour, that was 7 hours of pure cutting time, not counting the transportation. The bundles weighed approximately 100 pounds each when green, 6 poles at roughly 17 pounds per pole. He'd shoulder a bundle, walk 2 miles back to the construction site, drop the bundle, return to the creek for the next one. 4 miles round trip per bundle. 7 bundles meant 28 miles walked carrying heavy loads. By end of day 1, he'd cut and transported 2 bundles, 12 poles, 200 pounds moved 4 miles. His shoulders ached from the carrying. His hands had blisters from axe and knife work despite being calloused from farm labor. He'd walked 8 miles plus the working hours at creek bottom. Total productive output, 12 poles harvested and delivered. Days 2 through 5 followed similar pattern. Rise, eat, walk, cut, strip, bundle, carry, return, repeat. By evening of day 5, he had 40 poles stockpiled at the construction site, had walked approximately 35 miles carrying loads, had spent 40 hours of labor harvesting material that cost him nothing but sweat. The arch assembly began in mid-September and required solving the problem of bending green willow into precise curves without breaking the wood or creating asymmetrical arches that would weaken the structure. His first attempt was instructive failure. Took 2 poles, inserted them in holes on opposite edges of the floor platform, tried to bend them toward each other. The poles resisted, wanted to spring back, would kink rather than forming smooth curve. He solved it through pre-bending and progressive technique. Would soak poles overnight in creek water to maximize flexibility, then begin bending gradually, not forcing them into full arch immediately, but working from bottom upward, bending 6 inches at a time, holding the curve with temporary props, allowing the wood to adjust to the stress before continuing. The technique for a single arch: insert 2 pole butts in holes on opposite platform edges, secure them upright with earth packed around the bases. Begin bending the poles toward each other, starting at ground level. Bend 6 inches. Insert temporary prop supporting that portion of curve. Move up 6 inches. Bend again. Add another prop. Work progressively upward until the pole tips meet at center top, approximately 6 feet above the platform. When tips met, he'd lash them together with rope, creating secure apex joint. Then remove the temporary props one at a time from bottom upward, allowing the arch to settle into natural equilibrium. The completed arch would be semicircular, 6 feet high, 12 feet wide at base, naturally springy but holding shape under its own tension. Each arch took approximately 3 hours to complete, including the pre-bending preparation, progressive curve work, apex lashing, and final adjustment. He could complete 2 arches per day, working dawn to dusk. 8 arches required 4 days of intensive, careful work. The arches, spaced 2 feet apart, created tunnel framework running 16 feet length. But individual arches would rack sideways under uneven loads without lateral reinforcement. He added horizontal stringers, willow poles lashed perpendicular to the arches at 2-foot intervals along their height. The stringers created grid pattern that distributed loads and prevented individual arches from shifting independently. The completed framework by September 20th was remarkably strong despite being entirely natural materials lashed together with rope. Ben could climb onto it, walk along the arches, jump to test resilience. The structure would flex slightly under dynamic load but immediately recover. The willow's natural flexibility made it resilient rather than rigid, would bend in wind rather than breaking. The covering was the most critical element for keeping firewood dry, the difference between success and failure of the entire design. He needed weatherproof material that would shed water reliably, last through winter freeze-thaw cycles, and cost essentially nothing since his budget was nearly exhausted. Cottonwood bark was perfect material for multiple reasons. Grew abundantly along creek bottoms, could be harvested in large sheets from recently fallen trees without killing living timber, was naturally water-resistant due to waxy outer layer, would last 1 to 2 seasons before deteriorating, adequate for Ben's immediate needs. The harvest technique required finding recently fallen cottonwoods, trees knocked down by storms within the past 6 months. Fresh fallen trees had bark still firmly attached but not yet rotted. Too old and the bark would be punky and worthless. Living trees required killing them to harvest bark, wasteful and difficult. He found adequate source material along Wakarusa Creek. 3 large cottonwoods blown down during spring storms, now dead but bark still sound. Would walk to the creek carrying knife and rope, work on 1 tree at a time harvesting bark sheets. The cutting technique: make vertical cuts through bark down to wood approximately 3 feet apart around the circumference. Make horizontal cuts connecting the vertical slits. Use pry bar or sturdy stick to carefully separate bark from wood in large sheets. Each sheet would be roughly 3 feet by 4 feet, 12 square feet of material weighing 20 to 25 pounds when fresh. The bark would initially be curved, conforming to the tree's round shape. Ben would lay sheets flat, weighted with stones for several days, allowing them to relax somewhat while staying flexible enough to conform to the arch curve during installation. He needed to cover approximately 800 square feet of arch exterior. Accounting for 6-inch overlap between sheets, he needed roughly 70 sheets of bark. At perhaps 4 sheets harvested per day from creek work, that was 17 or 18 days of material gathering spread over late September. The actual harvesting was slow, careful work. Rush the prying and the bark would crack. Take too large a section and it would break under its own weight during transport. He learned optimal technique through trial. 3 by 4 foot sections, pried slowly, carried flat to avoid bending stress, laid out to partially flatten before installation. The bark installation began in late September and required precision to create truly weatherproof covering. Started at the bottom edge of the arches and worked upward like shingling a roof. Each sheet overlapped the one below it by 6 inches minimum, creating continuous downward shedding surface where water couldn't penetrate horizontal joints. He'd position a bark sheet against the willow framework from outside, hold it in place with his body weight, reach through the framework from inside with hammer and nails, drive nails through bark into willow at strategic points. Used nails sparingly, perhaps 6 nails per sheet, just enough to hold bark while it dried and conformed to the curve. The nails were his primary cash expense. Purchased 100 finishing nails for $3 at Lawrence Dry Goods Store. The nails were 2 inches long, thin enough not to split willow poles, headed to prevent pulling through bark. 100 nails would secure approximately 15 sheets with surplus for repairs. As the bark dried over subsequent weeks, it would shrink slightly and conform more tightly to the arch curve, creating increasingly tight seal. The natural curve of the bark sheets, remembering their original circular form, actually helped them conform to the arch rather than fighting it. He worked systematically around the structure, complete 1 vertical section from bottom to apex, move 2 feet laterally, complete next section. By working in vertical strips, he ensured proper overlap pattern that shed water effectively. Took 12 days to cover the entire 800 square foot surface with overlapping bark shingles. The ventilation gaps were designed in rather than accidental. Left 6-inch opening between the elevated floor platform and the bottom edge of bark covering, running continuously around entire perimeter except the access end. These gaps allowed air to flow through the structure, entering from one side, passing through the firewood stack, exiting the other side. The ventilation principle was critical for preventing moisture accumulation. Sealed shed with no airflow would trap humidity from ground evaporation and any moisture in the wood itself. That trapped moisture would condense on the wood surfaces during temperature swings, making everything damp. Continuous airflow carried moisture away before it could condense. The access opening was simply a space at the east end where no bark was applied, allowing him to walk into the structure and stack firewood. He could close this opening with a simple bark panel during severe weather if needed. By late September, the structure was complete. A semicircular arched building 12 feet wide, 16 feet long, 6 feet high at apex, covered with overlapping cottonwood bark, elevated on pole platform 18 inches above ground, with ventilation gaps around the perimeter. Total cost, $3 for nails, $2 for rope, $2 for basic tools he didn't already own. $7 total. He began moving his 3 cords of split firewood into the shed, stacking it on the elevated pole platform. The wood was well seasoned from summer drying, ready to burn efficiently if kept dry through winter. The first rain test came in early October, 2 inches of rain over 12 hours. Ben watched anxiously, expecting to find leaks that would soak his firewood. Instead, the rain ran off the curved bark surface like water off a duck's back. The overlapping bark shingles channeled water downward and outward. No drips penetrated to the interior. The firewood stayed completely dry. The first snow came in November. 6 inches of heavy wet snow that many expected would collapse the primitive willow structure. Instead, the snow slid off the curved surface as it accumulated, never building up dangerous weight. The arch shape worked exactly as Ben had predicted, shed snow naturally rather than collecting it. Through November and December, as weather alternated between rain, snow, and cold, the arched shed performed flawlessly and revealed why conventional firewood storage was fundamentally flawed despite being universally practiced. The first major test came November 8th, 18 hours of sustained rain totaling 3 inches. Ben watched the arched shed anxiously, expecting to discover leaks that would soak his carefully seasoned firewood. Instead, he observed water behavior that confirmed his design principles were sound. Rain would hit the curved bark surface and immediately begin flowing downward along the curve. The overlapping bark shingles channeled water in continuous sheets, no pooling, no penetration at horizontal joints. The water would run down the arch, reach the bottom edge, drip off harmlessly onto the ground well away from the elevated floor platform. He walked around the structure during the rain, examining the interior through the ventilation gaps. The firewood stacked on the elevated platform was completely dry. No drips penetrating from overhead. No water running down the interior surface of bark covering. The shingle overlap pattern was working perfectly. Water shed outward before it could find paths through the covering. After the rain stopped, he entered the shed to inspect more carefully. Ran his hands over the interior surface of the bark covering. Found it dry to the touch despite 3 inches of rain having fallen on the exterior. The overlapping pattern had created truly weatherproof barrier, using free material and minimal nails. The first snow came November 23rd. 8 inches of heavy wet snow falling over 12 hours. Many neighbors expected this would collapse Ben's primitive willow structure under snow weight that would easily exceed several hundred pounds distributed across the arch surface. Ben watched the snow accumulate and observed the arch's response. Snow would land on the curved surface and begin sliding downward along the curve even as it fell. The steepness of the arch sides, approximately 60 degrees from horizontal at the quarter points, was too steep for heavy wet snow to cling effectively. Snow would slide off in small continuous avalanches as fast as it accumulated. By the time the snow stopped, perhaps 2 inches remained on the very apex of the arch where the curve was flattest. The sides were clear. Snow had slid off continuously during the storm. The total snow load on the structure was perhaps 50 pounds rather than the 500 pounds that would have accumulated on a flat roof of similar area. He examined the arches after the snow. The willow framework showed no stress, no bending, no sign of strain. The curved geometry had done exactly what he'd calculated, shed load naturally rather than accumulating it. A flat roof would have borne the full weight. The arch refused to hold the weight in the first place. December brought mixed conditions, alternating snow, rain, brief warm spells, and hard freezes. This cycling created the worst conditions for firewood storage because moisture would freeze and thaw repeatedly, working its way deeper into wood grain with each cycle. The contrast with conventional storage became stark and measurable. John Mitchell's household had firewood stacked against the south wall of their house under simple roof overhang, extending perhaps 18 inches beyond the wall. The arrangement provided protection from direct vertical precipitation, but was completely vulnerable to horizontal weather and ground moisture. During rain, water would run off the roof overhang, drip along the edge, splash back against the firewood stack. Wind-driven rain would blow horizontally under the overhang, wetting the wood directly. Between storms, the firewood would dry somewhat in sun and wind. But ground moisture would wick upward continuously through the bottom layers in contact with earth. The freeze-thaw cycling made everything worse. Moisture that had penetrated the wood surface would freeze, expanding slightly and creating microscopic cracks in the wood grain. When temperature rose, the ice would melt, allowing liquid water to penetrate deeper into the newly created cracks. Next, freeze would expand water in these deeper locations, creating more cracks. The cycle progressively drove moisture inward. By mid-December, Mitchell's firewood stack exhibited clear signs of moisture contamination. The bottom 2 layers were visibly damp, darker color indicating water content, slightly soft texture when handled, frost forming on surfaces during cold mornings indicating moisture freezing in the wood. When Mitchell split one of these pieces to inspect the interior, he found the wood was wet 4 inches deep from the surface. Not just surface moisture, but genuine penetration. This wood would burn poorly, sizzling and steaming as moisture boiled off before combustion could occur, producing excessive smoke and reduced heat output. Ben's firewood in the arched ventilated shed showed completely different moisture characteristics. The elevated platform kept every piece 18 inches above ground, completely isolating it from ground moisture. The continuous ventilation gaps allowed airflow that carried away any humidity before it could condense on wood surfaces. The bark covering overhead prevented all direct precipitation while the arch geometry prevented snow accumulation. He'd checked the firewood weekly through December, examining pieces from different locations in the stack. Would split sample pieces to inspect interior moisture. Every piece remained perfectly dry, 15% moisture content, which was properly seasoned wood ready for efficient burning. The efficiency difference became measurable when burned. Mitchell's damp wood at 25% moisture would sizzle when placed in fire, release visible steam, produce thick smoke from incomplete combustion. Took perhaps 25% longer to burn and generated 25% less heat than properly dry wood. Ben's dry wood at 15% moisture would ignite quickly, burn with clean flame, produce minimal smoke, generate maximum heat output per pound. The difference wasn't subtle. It was immediately obvious to anyone comparing the 2 fires burning side by side. Ruth Harper's household, Ben's sister-in-law on Michael's homestead, faced identical problem. Their firewood was stacked in open-sided lean-to shed, protected from direct rain, but exposed to wind-driven moisture and ground dampness. The wood was increasingly wet, burning poorly, being consumed faster than it should. Ben's firewood remained perfectly dry in the arched shed. The elevated platform kept it completely isolated from ground moisture. The ventilation prevented condensation buildup. The bark covering shed all precipitation. The wood burned at 15% moisture content, properly seasoned, clean burning, maximum heat output. The efficiency difference was measurable. Ben's properly dry wood produced approximately 8,000 BTUs per pound at 15% moisture. Mitchell's damp wood at 25% moisture produced perhaps 6,000 BTUs per pound. 25% reduction in heat output requiring 25% more wood consumption for same heating. By late January, as cold snap dropped temperature to 0 degrees for a week, the firewood moisture problem became critical for families burning damp wood, and John Mitchell visited Ben's arched shed to investigate how $7 of primitive construction was outperforming his $40 conventional storage. He arrived January 28th around mid-morning, ostensibly making neighborly visit but actually consumed by need to understand why his expensive proper storage was failing while Ben's cheap willow and bark structure succeeded. The visit began with Mitchell watching Ben load firewood from the shed into canvas carrier for transport to his dugout. Ben would walk into the shed through the open end, select split pieces from the stack, examine them briefly, load them into the carrier. The wood made crisp, clean sounds when pieces struck together. The sharp crack of dry seasoned wood rather than the dull thud of damp wood. No visible moisture on surfaces. No frost indicating frozen water content. Just clean, straight splits ready to burn. "Your wood is completely dry," Mitchell said, standing outside the shed watching Ben work. "Bone dry. My wood under roof overhang is getting damper by the week and burning worse every time I feed the fire. Your $7 shed is outperforming my $40 conventional storage. I need to understand how." Ben invited Mitchell into the shed to examine the system directly. They walked through the access opening into the interior, standing on the elevated pole platform surrounded by stacked firewood. Mitchell's eyes adjusted to the dimmer interior light filtering through the bark covering and ventilation gaps. The first thing Mitchell noticed was air movement. Could feel slight breeze flowing through the structure, entering through ventilation gaps on the windward side, passing through the firewood stack, exiting through gaps on the leeward side. The air wasn't still and damp like enclosed space. It was moving continuously, carrying moisture away. "Air is flowing through," Mitchell observed, reaching down to feel the ventilation gap along the bottom edge. Continuous opening all around the perimeter except this entry side. The airflow prevents moisture accumulation that would condense on the wood. "Exactly," Ben confirmed. "Sealed shed traps humidity. Water evaporates from ground, moisture from any damp wood, humidity from temperature swings. All gets trapped and condenses on coldest surfaces, which are the wood pieces. Continuous ventilation carries that moisture away before condensation occurs." Mitchell knelt down and examined the elevated floor platform. The parallel cottonwood poles with 2-inch gaps between them creating slatted surface. Reached through one of the gaps and felt 18 inches of empty airspace beneath the platform. The firewood was completely isolated from ground contact. "Wood isn't touching ground anywhere," Mitchell said, understanding one of his storage flaws. "My wood sits directly on earth. Ground moisture wicks upward into bottom layers continuously. No amount of roof covering stops that. Your elevated platform breaks the moisture path completely." He stood and looked up at the bark covering overhead. Examined how the sheets overlapped, each upper sheet covering the lower edge of the sheet below it by 6 inches. Ran his hand along the interior surface of the bark. Found it dry to touch despite knowing snow and rain had fallen repeatedly on the exterior. "Bark overlap is like roof shingles," Mitchell observed. "Water runs down exterior surface, reaches overlap joint, continues downward on next lower sheet. Never finds horizontal path to penetrate inward. And the curve," he paused, looking at the arch shape, processing the geometry. "The curve prevents water pooling. Flat roof develops puddles that eventually leak through. Curved surface sheds water immediately. Snow too," Ben added. "Flat roof accumulates snow weight. Curved roof sheds it continuously. That 8-inch snowstorm in November, your flat shed probably held 400 pounds of snow. This arch held maybe 50 pounds because most slid off as it fell. Mitchell walked around the interior, examining construction details. The willow arches, with their simple rope lashings. The horizontal stringers creating grid framework. The bark sheets secured with minimal nails. Everything was primitive materials and simple technique, yet performing better than his conventional, expensive construction. "Your materials cost $7, Mitchell said, making final calculations. "My shed cost $40 in milled lumber. Your labor was perhaps 3 weeks cutting willows and harvesting bark. My labor was perhaps 2 weeks with purchased lumber. Your structure is keeping wood at 15% moisture ready for efficient burning. My structure is allowing wood to reach 25% moisture that burns poorly and wastes fuel. The difference is design working with natural principles rather than fighting them," Ben explained. "Your flat roof fights gravity, has to be strong enough to hold snow weight. My arch works with gravity, uses it to shed snow. Your enclosed design fights humidity, traps moisture requiring perfect sealing. My ventilated design works with airflow, lets moisture escape naturally." Mitchell reached through the ventilation gap and felt the moving air again. Cold air entering from outside, passing through the structure, picking up any humidity, exiting on the far side. Simple continuous process requiring no effort, no energy, just geometry and natural convection. "I'm burning 25% more wood than I should because my wood is damp," Mitchell admitted. "If I'd built your $7 shed instead of my $40 conventional storage, I'd have saved the construction cost plus the additional fuel consumption. The expensive conventional approach is actually more expensive in every way." "Most expensive isn't always best," Ben said simply. "Sometimes working with nature costs less and works better than fighting it." By spring 1865, 11 households in the Lawrence area had built arched willow firewood sheds using Ben's design principles. The construction was simple enough that most men could complete it in a week. The cost was minimal. The performance was superior to conventional expensive storage. Ben became informal consultant, helped neighbors plan arch dimensions, advised on bark harvesting and installation, designed ventilation systems for different conditions, was paid in labor barter, sometimes food, occasionally small amounts of cash. The income and respect exceeded anything he'd had as younger brother dependent on family. He proved up the abandoned 40-acre claim through continuous occupation and improvement. Built proper dugout house using techniques he'd refined with the firewood shed. The arched willow shed remained functional through 18 years, from 1864 to 1882, when Ben finally built conventional barn and no longer needed the primitive structure. Ben lived until 1912, dying at age 76. His obituary mentioned his homesteading and his family, but focused primarily on the arched firewood shed. The $7 structure that proved expensive wasn't always better when simple design worked with natural principles. Modern analysis of the few surviving arched willow structures confirmed the effectiveness. Conventional covered storage maintaining wood at 20 to 30% moisture content. Arched ventilated design maintaining wood at 15% moisture content, representing 30 to 40% improvement in fuel efficiency through pure storage design. The story is about a man who understood that being kicked out wasn't failure. It was opportunity to build better with less. Who recognized that geometry and ventilation mattered more than expensive materials. Who proved that the driest firewood isn't stored under the most expensive roof, it's stored in the structure that works with weather rather than fighting it. Because sometimes keeping wood dry is about letting air flow rather than sealing everything tight. The arched shed everyone called primitive was actually superior engineering. And $7 spent intelligently worked better than $40 spent conventionally.